Toxic people don't announce themselves with warning labels or obvious red flags. They often appear charming, helpful, even magnetic during initial encounters. Carl Jung understood that truly dangerous individuals operate through sophisticated psychological manipulation that targets the unconscious mind. While most people focus on obvious behaviors, lying, aggression, or selfishness, Jung recognized that the most damaging toxic people exploit deeper psychological mechanisms that bypass conscious awareness entirely. Through his clinical work, Jung identified specific psychological patterns that consistently indicate toxic personality structures. Jung wrote in The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But toxic people pervert this natural process, ensuring that all transformation flows in one direction, toward their benefit and others' detriment." Understanding Jung's insights about toxic psychology provides early warning systems that can protect you before significant damage occurs. The Shadow Projector. Jung observed that healthy individuals take responsibility for their own psychological material, their emotions, motivations, and internal conflicts. Toxic people, however, systematically refuse this responsibility, instead projecting their disowned psychological content onto others through what Jung called shadow projection. In Psychology and Alchemy, Jung wrote, "The shadow is the thing a person has no wish to be. Shadow projectors cannot tolerate acknowledging their own capacity for selfishness, cruelty, incompetence, or weakness. Instead, they unconsciously transfer these qualities onto others, particularly those closest to them." Jung explained that projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. The shadow projector will subtly suggest that you're being selfish when you set boundaries, that you're being cruel when you express needs, or that you're being weak when you show vulnerability. Over time, you begin internalizing their projections, carrying psychological material that doesn't belong to you. Shadow projectors often appear highly self-aware and psychologically sophisticated. They speak fluently about emotions, relationships, and personal growth. But Jung recognized that this apparent insight serves a defensive function. By analyzing others' psychology, they avoid examining their own. The telltale sign of shadow projection is how you feel after interactions. If you consistently leave conversations feeling guilty, confused, or somehow wrong, despite not having done anything obviously problematic, you're likely absorbing someone else's projected shadow material. Shadow projectors also engage in psychological reversal. When confronted about their behavior, they immediately flip the script, making you defend yourself against accusations that seem to come from nowhere. This technique destabilizes your psychological ground and makes you doubt your own perceptions. Another indicator is their relationship with responsibility. Shadow projectors have elaborate explanations for why their problems are always caused by external circumstances. Other people, bad luck, unfair systems. They present themselves as perpetual victims, while subtly making others feel responsible for their emotional state. Jung noted that shadow projectors often target empathetic, self-reflective individuals because these people are most likely to absorb projected material and least likely to immediately reject psychological responsibility. Your willingness to examine your own flaws becomes a vulnerability they exploit. Pay attention to people who never seem to experience guilt, shame, or self-doubt about their own behavior while frequently pointing out these issues in others. This psychological imbalance indicates active shadow projection. The boundary dissolver. Jung's concept of participation mystique describes a primitive psychological state where boundaries between self and other become dangerously blurred. Healthy relationships involve some degree of psychological merger, but toxic people weaponize this natural process to dissolve others' psychological boundaries entirely. Boundary dissolvers operate through what Jung called unconscious identity. They merge their psychological material with yours so completely that you lose the ability to distinguish between your thoughts and theirs, your emotions and theirs, your needs and theirs. This process begins subtly through excessive early intimacy. The boundary dissolver shares deeply personal information too quickly, creating artificial closeness that feels meaningful but actually serves to lower your psychological defenses. They position this oversharing as special connection or unusual compatibility. Jung wrote in Psychological Types, "The subject cannot clearly distinguish himself from the object, but is bound to it in a relationship of almost mystical character." Boundary dissolvers cultivate this mystical feeling to create psychological dependency that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. They also employ what Jung observed as emotional contagion, unconsciously transmitting their emotional states into your psychological space. You find yourself feeling anxious, depressed, or agitated after spending time with them, but the emotions feel like your own rather than externally imposed. Boundary dissolvers often use language that erases psychological separation. "We feel this way," "We need to do this," or "Our relationship requires this." They speak as if you're a single psychological unit rather than two separate individuals, gradually training you to think in merged rather than individual terms. Another technique involves what Jung called psychic infection, the unconscious transmission of psychological content from one person to another. You begin adopting their opinions, preferences, and even behavioral patterns without conscious choice, as if their personality is gradually overriding your own. The most dangerous aspect of boundary dissolution is that it feels like love or deep connection. The merger creates temporary relief from existential loneliness and individual responsibility. By the time you recognize the toxicity, your sense of self has become so intertwined with theirs that separation feels like psychological death. Watch for people who seem to know your thoughts and feelings better than you do, who speak for you in social situations, or who become distressed when you express individual preferences that differ from theirs. The complex exploiter. Jung discovered that everyone develops psychological complexes, clusters of emotionally charged material around core life themes like authority, intimacy, success, or abandonment. Healthy people recognize and work with their own complexes. Toxic people unconsciously map others' complexes and exploit them for psychological control. Complex exploiters possess an uncanny ability to identify your emotional vulnerabilities within relatively brief interactions. They seem to intuitively understand exactly what triggers your insecurities, hopes, fears, and desires. This apparent empathy initially feels like deep understanding, but it's actually psychological reconnaissance. Jung wrote in The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, "Complexes are autonomous groups of associations that have split off from consciousness. Complex exploiters target these split-off areas because they operate below conscious awareness and create predictable emotional reactions. If you have an abandonment complex, they'll alternate between excessive attention and mysterious withdrawal, keeping your attachment system constantly activated. If you struggle with authority issues, they'll position themselves as either perfect mentors or rebellious allies, depending on what maintains their influence. The exploitation operates through what Jung called constellation, deliberately triggering your complex to create emotional intensity that feels meaningful but actually serves their control needs. They become experts at activating your psychological wounds precisely when doing so serves their purposes. Complex exploiters often present themselves as healers or helpers for your psychological issues. They position themselves as the solution to problems they're actually perpetuating, creating cycles of dependency where you need them to manage emotional states they're deliberately triggering. Notice people who seem to have unusual insight into your emotional patterns, but use this knowledge to create drama, dependency, or confusion rather than genuine support or understanding. Jung's protection protocol. Jung's approach to protection from toxic people centered on what he called individuation, developing such psychological completeness that external manipulation becomes ineffective. This involves strengthening your relationship with your own unconscious material so others cannot exploit it. The first line of defense is what Jung termed shadow work, acknowledging and integrating your own capacity for the qualities you judge in others. When you accept your own potential for selfishness, manipulation, or cruelty, these qualities in others lose their power to shock, guilt, or destabilize you. Jung wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, "The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are. Toxic people target individuals who are disconnected from their authentic nature and dependent on external validation. The more complete your self-relationship, the less vulnerable you become to psychological exploitation. Develop what Jung called active imagination, regular conscious engagement with your own psychological material through meditation, journaling, or creative expression. This practice strengthens your ability to distinguish between your authentic thoughts and emotions versus externally imposed psychological content. When you become psychologically complete, toxic people find you uninteresting because you don't provide the emotional reactions, dependency, or psychological chaos that feeds their distorted needs. Your wholeness becomes your protection,